Hello. We have with us this afternoon Teresa Cordova, a professor of community and regional planning and the director of the Community and Regional Planning Program. It's a pleasure to have Teresa here to talk about her community activism, about the teaching that she does, and about her research and professional interests in the community. Teresa you came to the university many years ago from work you were doing in Chicago. You got your PhD and your MA at the University of California at Berkeley, where, as I understand it, as a PhD student, you also served on the City Planning Commission. Could you tell us a little bit about the courses that you teach and how it is that those courses relate to some of the interests that you've got?
Mm-hmm. Glad to. One of my favorite courses that I just started teaching a few years back is our Introduction to Community and Regional Planning. As you know, we were asked to take over the Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Planning and Design. And since we've taken that over, we've built that into a really incredible undergraduate program. Many of our students who graduate from that program have gone on to apply to master's programs, be accepted to master's programs in great universities throughout the country and even in Canada. So I started teaching the undergraduate class of that, for that program. And it's a required course for them. And I inherited that class from some of our colleagues who established the objective of the class to explore the interrelated factors shaping the creation of place, shaping communities. So I really build on this notion of interrelated factors. What are those interrelated factors? And that's everything from economic to geological to geographical to cultural, to the specifics of a given context. What are those factors and how those factors interplay? And then what are the ways in which then actors can be involved then in having an impact on how a community develops? So in that class then, they are exposed to the different aspects of our program, including economic development, watershed management, for example, the urban design, et cetera, et cetera. I teach that course in fall semester as a 16-week class, but I also teach it as an intersession class. And that's a ball because, well, they both are, but the intersession is a very intense 1-week class. So during that time, during the period of that 1 week, they are then exposed to not only a variety of techniques to deliver the information, but also the opportunity for they themselves to engage. So one of those days, the Wednesday of that week, they go out on a scavenger hunt. And they have to go looking for maps or design projects or comprehensive plans. And we have great partners, of course, in the planning program. We have great partners with folks from the Council of Governments, from nonprofit groups, from Mesa del Sol, from the local governments, from economic development centers. And through that process then of going out and visiting these sites, they get a chance to see, for example, what the water treatment plant looks like, for example, and what that process is. They get a chance to see the transportation center of the state, where traffic is viewed and I don't want to say regulated, but kind of monitored. They also go to Mesa del Sol, and they're able to talk to folks up there that tell them about this planned community. So it's very exciting. And then by the end of the week, they have to produce a group project, and they have to be able to produce some project that reflects their work of the week. And it's always really amazing and so exciting to see what they're able to do as a result of their work during the course of that week. It's pretty exciting.
I know. Personally, because I've heard from students that in both of these formats you have inspired a number of students to apply to and come into the graduate planning program, or to move into in the case of intersession or at the freshman level when students are just looking around to try to figure out what to study or to major in. You've attracted them. And I understand you also teach that in a distance education format.
Right. I should rename the intersection of their class "How to Have Fun in Planning." Right.
Yeah. Right.
The distance education is a little bit more challenging. I'm still getting still feeling my way around that class. But what I've tried to do there is provide a graduate student the opportunity to take the leadership in that class. So that being able to monitor that as the professor, but then give a graduate student an opportunity, builds their ability to be not only familiar with what are some of the basic aspects of planning, but also to then be in a teaching role of their own.
Terrific. How does this teaching students what are the basic components of what planners do and how cities work, how does that work with you teach a graduate seminar, a required class called the Foundations of Community Development? Tell us a little about that, how that course works.
That's another fun class to teach. As you say, it's called the Foundations of Community Development. So with our three emphases, we have a foundations course for each one of them, natural resource planning and then the physical planning. So this is the community development piece of that. So we begin with, first of all, defining what is community. What do we even mean when we talk about community, right? And so we get into discussions of the various concepts of community, again with that notion in mind of thinking about what it is we want to achieve by virtue of our work. And not only in this class, in all my classes, but in my work, my research and my writing, I emphasize community a lot and the importance of community. You know, I see the notion of community and all that suggests in terms of the interconnectivity, the mutual support, the collective ownership, the collective decision making. All that I think are really key strategies for us as we wade through all these various kinds of political, economic trends or developments in which we find ourselves. So the notion of community becomes very important. So a lot of the class then is what does it take to build community? Is the point. You know, what are the kinds of processes in which we need to engage in order to have an impact on how communities are shaped? So of course that involves one piece of it, the essence of who we are, and the idea of the citizen involvement and increasing people's capacities to be engaged in the shaping of their own communities. But it also involves looking at what are some of the basic aspects of what it takes to live in a community, such things like infrastructure, for example. So I find it fun to make it interesting to talk about drainage, for example, and water and wastewater treatment. And so all those kinds of basic infrastructures, as well as newer infrastructures like your coaxial cables and digital, so on. What does it take to provide infrastructure in our communities? But since this is a community development piece of it, part of what I look at, or part of what we talk about in the class, is how to look at infrastructure in the context of community development. So that even the design, the level of the scale of that development, the water system, for example, there are certain kinds of level of service that will make a difference in what happens in that community. So looking at the design of a road, for example, and how that either enhances or detracts from an historic community, for example, or an historic corridor. So we look at infrastructure, we look at economic development, everything from economic policy, everything from industrial revenue bonds and various tax incentives. We look at controversial topics like tax increment financing, for example, and here we call them tax increment development districts, all the way to looking at community economic development strategies. And how do you build and circulate capital in a community, and what are some of the strategies to do that? So that's something that we talk about in the class. Housing, of course, even before getting to that, some of the basics of planning, comprehensive planning process, and some of the basics of land use, without getting into too much detail, of course, because that's what you cover in your course, but at least in the overview and in the context of talking about building communities. So that part of what I'm really trying to do there is not only get them thinking about what it takes to build communities, but I'm focusing on building their analytical skills. I think it's very important that they learn not just facts and even methods, but the analytical part. How do they approach a problem, for example? How do they think about that? I think that's something that we all focus on. And then towards the end of the class, then there's more focus on some of the methodologies, whether it be strategic planning process, for example, or research. I focus a lot on how research can be used in the community development process, for example. That's a taste of some of what I do in that class. They also, if I may add, have to do a community project. They have to do some kind of, they have to do in that class.
Yeah.
So we've done everything from surveys related to road construction, to doing testimony with the Petroglyph Coalition on planned communities criteria. This semester, the students in that class did a study of Western North Dakota and gas and oil extraction and what the impacts of some of that gas and oil extraction is on the local communities. So being good community-based planning students, the first thing they said was, okay, great, we see the relevance of this, we see all the planning implications and the importance of this on a larger scale, but if we're going to do it, then we need to go there.
Oh,
So
really?
we went to Western North Dakota,
Yep.
and it was quite exciting and quite interesting. And what I found most exciting was the responsiveness of the students to the research process. And they really got out there and really engaged in finding out. And in finding out, they were also able to see that some of the expectations, the preconceptions that they had are altered once you start talking to people and once you start doing some of the research. So that's pretty exciting.
So it must have had a pretty big effect on the group of students who went up there and saw a wholly different part of the country.
Right. Their fellow students would say, "You're going to North Dakota?" And as soon as they would start talking about why, then people would say, we see the importance of this.
So the third course that you teach is the political economy of urban development. Can you tell us a little bit about the purpose, the impact of that class?
Yeah, I love that class, and one of the things that I find important about that class is that even though I will have some undergraduates, it's a graduate class, but I will have some undergraduates in there. It really is a PhD level class in the terms of what we cover and who we read and the issues that we tackle. So it's really fun taking the students through a process to get them to a point where they can really examine what are some of these really complex issues having to do with the political economy of urban development. So I begin by introducing them to how to think about theory and so we look at different schools of thought and their explanations of how a city develops. So we go back to some of the sociological theories of urban ecology, for example. We look at some of the neoclassic material. We look at theories around capital accumulation and how the relationship to capital and the development of cities has occurred over time. The role of political elites and how that shapes cities. So what they're looking for there is what are the underlying assumptions that each of these theorists or set of theorists make about how a city grows. What are the units of analysis that they use? What are some of the beginning assumptions that they make about urban change, for example? So that's how we begin. Then we look at post-World War II economic policies, including Keynesian approaches, for example, to urban policy. And after we study that and look at some of those policies and how they then get played out in in cities, by that time we move up to the mid-70s, to the point of the crisis. At that time, the crisis of the mid-70s of the economic system. And in looking at that crisis and what the trends that led to that crisis, we then talk about how the economic system went through a process of restructuring. So what was that process of restructuring? What were the precipitating dynamics that led to that restructuring? How do we characterize that restructuring? And what were some of the impacts of that? So one of them, of course, is the shift in the extraction of surplus from the production process. So that's when we begin to see, for example, international division of labor. We began to see, we didn't just begin to see because it was actually quite rapid, the deindustrialization of the United States manufacturing sector. So we spend a lot of time on that piece, and we look at the devastation that caused in so many of our American cities, and what that meant in terms of the challenges to those cities. We also look at the changing role of the state and the shift away from the social contract and the demise of that, and then later, as the semester proceeds, we continue all of these themes and see how those themes get played out. But then thirdly, we look at the internationalization of economic activities. So once we lay out that economic restructuring, then we get to the notions then of the global cities and the various dynamics as they get played out in global cities. So we're reading everything from the work of Manuel Castells to Saskia Sassen, a whole slew of folks. And then David Harvey, but as we look at this rise of global cities, we're also then looking at how that gets played out in urban policies, for example, in the 80s and into the 90s. Then we also look at what has been some of the responses of these cities. So from there we get into what is the response, and from the grassroots, from local communities, and then ultimately how can planning and the planners play a role in working with some of these very pressing urban policy issues that emerge out of these several decades of historical dynamics.
Well, it sounds like the courses that you teach really help students understand theory, the way we think about things, and especially in community development and the undergraduate class, what planning does in the context of that theory, and as important, what is out there, getting students outside of the class in the other courses to see how that theory is played out, what its impacts are on the ground, and what planners do to work on that. I know you've had a long record in working in the community. You and I and Claudia Isaac worked for many years on neighborhood projects. And can you tell us a little about your community activism and research and applied research interests? You created in 1996 the Resource Center for RASA Planning, RCRP. Tell us a little about that. That kind of work is reflected in the teaching that you do. I know you bring many of the things into the classroom.
Well, and before I get to the Resource Center for RASA Planning, let me just say a little bit too about the connection, for example, between that political economy class and some activism around that, which related to the environmental justice work. We know through the early 90s we had very strong environmental justice organizations that were involved in taking on Intel as a large manufacturer of microchips. So one of the things that I was very interested in at that time was the interplay between global and local. I mean, I remain interested in that topic, how the global dynamics get played out locally, and what are the possibilities and local responses to those global dynamics, which again, what's the role of the planner, right? So as time went on, one of the things that I did, and actually with your help, because remember we got the HUD work study grants to bring in some students, Chicano students, African American students, Native students into the planning program and offer them internships and so on. So it became very clear to me that planning, community regional planning in particular at the University of New Mexico, really provided an opportunity for many of our folks from this region to be able to get a degree that not only would give them a career, but would give them the ability to be able to work directly in their communities and deal with issues in their communities. That became a motivation then for attracting a number of students who are from this region to our program. And then with a critical mass, we then formed the Resource Center for RASA Planning. The mission of the planning of the center was to promote the sustainability and survivability of traditional communities in New Mexico. So in face of large, increased urbanization, in the face of processes of gentrification, for example, in the face of various global dynamics, what does it take for communities to be able to not only plan for the future, but plan for the future by virtue of bringing forward that which is important to them from the past. So we have such a rich legacy in New Mexico of traditional communities, whether it's their traditional acequia systems or whether it's their set of social relations and so on. So it became very important to the students who helped form the Resource Center for RASA Planning that we use research, policy analysis, and some of the other tools that we have in planning to be able to directly address some of the needs of these communities. So at the time we talked about, and it's still part of our mission, the importance of planning as interdisciplinary, the importance of planning in terms of building long-term relationships, that you didn't just go in and go out, but you established relationships that you held over time, that the work was cross-generational, that we involved elders, we involved young people, and that you really directly applied some of that which a university has to offer to addressing some of the needs in communities. So very early on, one of the first things we did was educate ourselves. We had Plática series to talk about water law and water policy, economic development, and then it wasn't long before students started getting very itchy. So let's do some real projects and let's get really involved. So we did the economic development policy section of a land use plan, the Southwest Area Plan. We got very involved in public infrastructure and the public participation process for public infrastructure projects.
Isn't there a plaza in the southern part of the state?
We worked and that was interesting because we worked with landscape architects and architecture faculty in the different pieces of that process, and ours was to do some of the historical and demographic background, as well as to facilitate a community visioning process that then was used as a basis then to create a plaza, and we worked with the local senator down there, Mary Jane Garcia, and there is a plaza there now, so that was a direct output.
One of the other outcomes, I understand, of early work and a lot of hard work is an economic development center in the South Valley.
That was
a huge investment and an incubator for new businesses.
In planning at University of New Mexico, of course, we are very big on community-based practice. We're very big on the partnerships that we form with various entities, right, including nonprofit groups and community development corporations. One of those was the Rio Grande Community Development Corporation. And I was actually on the board of that organization for a number of years. But the Resource Center for Costa Planning knew that the RGCDC wanted to develop a small business incubator. And they wanted to do that as part of a larger strategy to promote self-employment as a way to build household wealth and community health. Right, the idea of let's get those dollars circulated through this community. Mm-hmm. And in that community, which is southwest of Albuquerque and adjacent to, which is the further south you go, it's increasingly more semi-rural and even rural, that they didn't have very much access to goods and services. So besides wanting to create this opportunities for self-employment, we also wanted to create places where people could purchase goods and services. One of the things that we had done in our academic development plan is we had worked through the relationship between land use, between location, and the types of economic activity. So we knew what corridors were good for small business, for example, and that was along the Isleta Boulevard corridor. Mm-hmm. So knowing that RGCDC wanted to do this, we sought a grant. It was Hispanic Serving Institutions Assisting Communities grant from HUD. We were awarded that grant, and with it, we were able to then provide the technical assistance and work alongside the Rio Grande Community Development Corporation to get this facility built. That work involved everything. I mean, we raised the 1.8 million of the 2.2 that was necessary.
That's extraordinary.
And that involved writing business plans and pro formas. It involved writing employment plans. A lot of the narrative that was necessary to do this project. We did a lot of brokering of relationships. We set up community advisory committees. We did door-to-door surveys. We worked with the architect. It was just extensive, the amount of activities that the students were involved in. And one of the things that was so important for them to see is how tedious and how involved the development process is. So they learned all the nitty-gritty details of what it really takes to make a development happen. And the doors are open. It's a successful effort for economic development in that community. And
it's just used. You have more recently worked on youth development, youth entrepreneurship.
Youth entrepreneurship. Yeah. One of the things that we see in the same community, and it's true it's true in other parts of Albuquerque and the state, and it's true nationally, which is a lot of our young folks, 18 to 24, for a number of reasons, are not having easy, including the still coming out of the recession, are having a hard time finding employment, right? And one of the things that we think again is really important as a theme is the value of self-employment. So we have teamed up with a professor from business, Dante de Gregorio, and what we've been doing is working on curriculum that combines not only entrepreneurship, but a community engagement piece of that. So Nelson Andrade, who's just getting ready to defend his professional project, is going to be presenting the details of that curriculum on ways in which we're combining various aspects of a community engagement process, everything from the asset to strategic planning and ways to actually get some of these young people involved in their own communities. And he's got visioning exercises, and he was a former teacher, so he has a real sense of how to put together lesson plans. So it truly is going to be a curriculum that will be made available to other people to use, and then we ourselves will use it in an increased partnership with the South Valley Economic Development Center. And then again with the entrepreneurial piece of that, we'll be working with young people to be able to develop their own small businesses. And at the same time, not only increase their involvement with their own communities, but build personal skills, such as resilience, for example, and all that goes along with having to develop their own business.
Just listening to you, one of the extraordinary things is the degree to which you've involved students from the planning program, undergraduates and graduate students, in real projects that you've been working on through RCRP, or other initiatives that relationships and partnerships that have grown over the years. I'm wondering that as director of the program, providing leadership now, thinking across your teaching, across the large globalization, research and theoretical interests you've got, and these important community-based connections, what it is that you see for the next generation of planners.
Well, it was interesting when we went to North Dakota. We came back with a really clear understanding about the importance of planners. That was said to us, right, by people that we talked to, right, that in order to deal with that kind of rapid influx, not only of economic activity, but the population that goes along with that, how important it is to think about what are the long-term implications, right, and how do we plan for it? How do we plan for it? We don't want to just sit, they don't want to just sit and be, I don't want to say victims of, but be subject to whatever changes occur, but to actually have a say-so in shaping that. And, in North Dakota is such a, we joked about it being North Dakota nice, because there are such nice people up there, right, who have a very, very stable communities. So the role of planning, right, is very key. But when we look at why is that kind of economic activity happening in Western North Dakota, why are these people facing these kinds of issues? Well, it very much has to do with our national policies as well as the whole international economy around energy, right? So there are these global dynamics that are being played out at a very, very local level, right? So the whole, one of the things the class is looking at is energy policy and the energy economy, right? And so not only what is the impacts on a local community, what are the impacts on the environment, right? And our long-term survival. Fracking, for example, it's a different kind of fracking that's going on in Pennsylvania, but the question still needs to be asked, what are the impacts, for example, of this particular extraction technique? So it points to the global and the local, but part, in answering your question, it points to the potential and very important role of planners in working with communities. So not only and I don't want to think about planners as outside the communities, but how do we get planners from those communities? People don't typically think about planning as a profession. They know about being a doctor and a lawyer, but planning, you don't necessarily say I'm going to become a planner. If people become planners, they're usually exposed to it somewhere along the way, or exposed to a planner. Right, so part of it is, I think, is really introducing more people to the value and to the importance, right? And I think the kind of planning we do at UNM has very important applicability beyond just this city or this region, right? The sort of the whole community-based planning approach, whether we're working with a local government or a nonprofit, there's still this idea that we all need to be, as citizens, thinking about what our future is going to be. And so how do we use planning processes and techniques, right, to engage in a process that's going to take us someplace that is about community, right? And along with that, I think the values that we discuss, and even in our statement on justice, becomes very important.
Well, and what I hear you saying, and the importance of building the local capacity to ask the right kind of questions and be able to engage in the future of creating community. So thank you, Teresa.